London, 1954. Midnight. The streetlights die across a silent suburban road. A stylish 21-year-old in a black silk dress walks home alone. Then a desperate scream rips through the darkness. Two men shout. A violent scuffle in the long grass. Silence falls. At dawn, a workman discovers her body carefully posed like a sleeping doll, strangled by her own scarf, shoes and stockings neatly placed beside her. No fingerprints, no sexual assault, no motive. She was Jean Townsend, the glamorous West End costumier who dressed the stars. Her killer has never been caught. This is the chilling, unsolved murder of the girl in black. Welcome to Crimes That Haunt Us. We release a new case every Sunday, so hit subscribe and don't miss the next one. And let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Jean Mary Townsend came into this world on the 11th of March 1933 and grew up in a tidy, quiet suburban neighborhood in South Ruislip, London. She lived with her parents at the family home on Bempton Drive. Her mother was Lillian Townsend and her father, Reginald Frank Townsend, who worked at the GPO. The family home stood in a respectable, post-war suburban setting, the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and lives unfolded in ordinary rhythms typical of the era. By her early adulthood, Jean had stepped into the glittering world of London's fashion and theatre scene. She worked as a theatrical costumier in the West End, beginning as a seamstress at M. Berman Limited Theatrical Costumers on Irvine Street near Leicester Square. One of the largest costumers in the world, with branches in Hollywood, Rome and Paris. She had been working there since she was 16. Later, she rose to become manager and personal assistant to the renowned designer Michael Whitaker, known as Mr. Fashion, the man who would later create the iconic catsuit for Kathy Gale in The Avengers. She occasionally worked as a model herself and was described by her employer as a very sweet girl, intelligent and charming. She had connections to stage and screen stars, moved in the sophisticated circles of Soho clubland, yet she rarely drank. She was involved in pyramid parties, those face-to-face chain-letter-style social and fundraising events so popular in post-war austerity Britain, where participants exchanged cash. Her daily commute from suburban Ruislip to central London was routine. She is described as elegant and glamorous, with a perfect body. On the 6th of September 1954, a vicious murder took place in nearby Pimlico, sending fresh shockwaves through an already uneasy London. Miss Ellen Carlin, 28, originally from Derry, Londonderry, had been viciously strangled to death in a Pimlico flat with her own stockings. Ellen, known as Red Helen, had been working as a sex worker at the time of her murder. She had been seen in the company of a US Air Force sergeant in the days leading up to her murder. This killing remains unsolved and would later surface in the investigation of Jean Townsend as a potential link. At 11:45 p.m. on the 13th of September, just 24 hours before Jean Townsend would be murdered, a woman named Brenda Thompson, who would become a vital witness, was walking home alone along Victoria Road when she spotted two men standing on either side of the road in a menacing manner near the waste ground where Jean would ultimately be found. One of them tried to approach her, prompting her to run home, terrified. The next day, the 14th of September, Jean had worked her usual shift at the costume department in Leicester Square with nothing unusual occurring. She then headed back home to Bempton Drive to get ready for an evening out with friends at the Pyramid Club party in the West End of London. She dressed carefully, a black silk dress, black earrings, black velvet court shoes. She finished the look with a black silk scarf with a thin gold line running through it. At 9 p.m., she excitedly told her father she was heading out for the evening and left. She met two female friends at Piccadilly. They then made their way to the Londoner Club in Trafalgar Square. Each had paid their £0.50 subscription to this club. There was nothing unusual reported by her friends that evening. It was a fun, sociable event. Jean then left for the train back home, leaving at 11 p.m. She caught the last Central Line train to South Ruislip station. At 11:45 p.m., Jean is observed by witnesses arriving at South Ruislip Station. It is thought that she missed the last bus home, but given the mild weather, she then set off on her walk. This should have ordinarily taken about 12 minutes to reach home. Further witnesses then state they saw Jean walking along Victoria Road. Between 11:45 and 11:50 p.m., Brenda Thompson, the same woman who had encountered the two strange men standing either side of the road the previous night, lived by the wasteland, her bedroom overlooking the exact spot where Jean Townsend would be found. She heard a lady screaming the word "help." Startled, she got up to look out the window but saw nothing due to the low light. A short time afterwards, she then heard two men arguing. She described this exchange as shouting, but not lasting very long. She described one of these men as having an American accent or a nasally twang. She said this man sounded agitated. Again, she saw nothing when she looked out of the window. It is estimated that between 11:45 to 12:30 a.m., Jean Townsend was viciously murdered. She would lay dead for several hours into the early morning. Sometime in the early hours of September 15th, a U.S. Embassy worker named James Odell, who was stationed at the Vale some 300 yards from where Jean would be found killed, chased off a prowler with a tennis racket. He described this prowler as wearing a brown coat and jacket and as being bald. Then at 7 a.m. September 15th, a workman on his way to his shift found Jean's body at the corner of Victoria Road and Angus Drive, just a few feet off the footpath in the long grass. At first, he was puzzled at what he was looking at. On closer inspection, the horrifying truth became clear. There lay dead the girl in black. He raced off to summon the police. Tragically, Jean's parents had ridden the bus into work just 30 minutes before this discovery and had come within just 5 yards of where their beloved daughter lay dead as the bus passed. Both parents had been very anxious. Their daughter had never stayed out overnight before. The police then arrived on scene and began to cordon off the area and started the grim task of gathering evidence. Immediately apparent was that the long grass had been flattened, indicating she had been either dragged there or there had been some type of struggle. The state pathologist soon arrived thereafter. It is quickly established that she had been strangled with her own black and gold silk chiffon scarf. Remarkably absent, apart from the obvious asphyxiation signs, were any defensive wounds, scratches, or indications of physical resistance. The scarf had been wrapped tightly around her neck 3 times, though it wasn't knotted. Detectives found that her killer had taken great care in arranging her body post-mortem. She had been left positioned as though she had been sleeping peacefully. She was found fully clothed except for her shoes and stockings. Her clothing had been rearranged neatly, and her stockings, shoes, suede gloves, and handbag were found neatly placed beside her. The stockings had been carefully rolled up. There were no signs of sexual assault. Detectives were unable to produce any fingerprints from any of Jean's clothing nor the body. At midday that September 15th, Jean's anxious, stricken father made a phone call to police to report his daughter missing. But police were already investigating her murder, and it was at this moment they were able to ID the dead woman thanks to this phone call. Reginald then made the gut-wrenching task of identifying his daughter's body at the morgue. Police initially pondered whether Jean had either been abducted or initially offered a lift home, then murdered and then discarded on the wasteland where she lay discovered. The Metropolitan Police launched an extensive inquiry. They would end up taking over 600 statements. Local suspicion quickly focused on American servicemen stationed at the nearby RAF South Ruislip, a non-flying USAF base housing the 3rd Air Force with thousands of personnel. This was primarily prompted by the immediate reporting by half a dozen young women claiming to have been stalked or harassed by an American accented man along the Victoria Road area in the recent weeks. On that September 15th day, police announced they were following a new line of inquiry. They now believed that Jean Townsend was murdered by two men who had jumped out from behind shrubbery whilst Jean walked the unlit Victoria Road. The street lighting was turned off after midnight, as was custom in 1954 London, allowing her killers to hide in darkness before they pounced. These men were described as wearing dark plastic raincoats and gabardine trousers, with at least one of these men speaking in an American accent. The first man is described as 5 feet 5 inches tall, aged 28, with a sturdy build and wavy dark hair with a full face. The second man is described as 4 inches taller, with a broad and thick-set build, dark hair, and a high forehead. Police believed these were the two men who had approached Brenda Thompson just before midnight the previous day, very close to the spot where Jean was found. Given that US Army personnel were stationed nearby at the time, detectives began visiting the barracks on multiple occasions but were not able to get any credible leads. On the 16th of September, police took into their possession some blood-stained clothing that had been handed in to a dry cleaners in South Ruislip. A man described as aged between 24 to 26, stockily built, wearing civilian clothing, with a high forehead and an American accent, had handed in a red checked shirt, blood-stained on both sides. He also handed in gabardine trousers that were blood-stained on the front. This man's eye and cheek were bloodied with what is said to be fresh scratches. The shop owner asked him if he had been in a fight, to which he replied, "Sort of." 2 days later, September 18th, officers investigating the strangling murder of Miss Ellen Carlin over in Pimlico appealed to all police stations across the country for a man described as a baby-faced American in connection with her killing. He is described as aged between 22 to 24, 6 feet to 6 feet 2 inches tall, fair complexion, with a clean-shaven baby face. They also began looking for any possible links with the Jean Townsend murder. The following day, September 19th, police revealed that they had received numerous reports from young women in the immediate area who had been stalked, followed, or harassed by men along the Victoria Road. One report was taken from a 19-year-old Jacqueline Cliff, a model who was stalked multiple times by a man driving a large American car and who had spoken in an American accent. He had followed her in his car multiple times over the last 6 months, and on 2 of those occasions he had asked her if she wanted sex. On the last occasion, he swung his car around towards her, forcing her onto the exact wasteland spot where Jean was murdered. These encounters always occurred as the streetlights dipped out after midnight. Jacqueline spoke of knowing Jean Townsend personally to see over the years and that they had often shared the same train carriage back from central London. She said that Jean always walked on the left side of Victoria Road due to the better lighting. Also came a report from a 22-year-old woman who told police she was attacked in the same area as Jean the previous Saturday. Joan Galler had a man attempt to strangle her on Victoria Road, but after she bravely fought back and screamed, he retreated into the darkness. She described the man as aged between 20 to 30 with a high forehead. Other reports came in of men hiding behind bushes and following women as they walked alone at night. Also on the 19th, police appealed for a man who had been travelling by a London transport the evening Jean was murdered. This man is described as young and wearing a fawn-coloured Macintosh. He had boarded the 158 London transport bus at 11:58 p.m. on the 14th of September at the junction of Victoria Road and Westmead, just yards from where Jean was found murdered. He then alighted at 12:12 a.m. at the junction of Grant Road and High Street in Wealdstone. It is unknown if this man is ever located by police. On the 20th of September, Scotland Yard appealed for help tracing a dark-coloured sports car, possibly an MG, which contained 2 24-year-olds. The car had been seen on Victoria Road the night Jean was murdered and again days later around the Ruislip area. At the same time, police announced that they had officially traced and ruled out the bloodied man that handed in the blood-stained clothing at a South Ruislip dry cleaners. He is said to be a US serviceman who was not involved in Jean's murder. On October 10th, news then broke of a similar sinister assault on a woman just over 2 miles away from where Jean Townsend was murdered. Doris Mary Vennall of Chester Drive, Pinner, had been out celebrating her birthday with friends when she boarded the 11:45 p.m. Baker Street train home. She noticed a man also boarded and sat opposite her. This man stared and made her incredibly uncomfortable. Miss Vennall described him as a dark-haired, clean-shaven man aged around 28 with a high forehead and a pale face, wearing a grey belted raincoat. This man then followed her off the train as it arrived at North Harrow at 12:10 a.m. As she got onto Chester Drive, she turned and asked him if he was following her. He mumbled something and grabbed her by the throat, but she bravely fought back, grabbing and ripping off 4 buttons from his coat. He then fled back in the direction of North Harrow Station. On the 19th of October, the Coroners Inquest delivered its verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. Coroner Mr. H.G. Broadbridge said that hundreds of people had been interviewed so far in the case. He also referenced the fact that lots of little clues found early on in the investigation had turned out to be utterly worthless, but police continued their hunt. Police now held firmly to a new theory in the Jean Townsend murder. They believed that one of the 2 men that night had spotted Jean passing by and attempted to engage with her. Frightened, Jean ran, resulting in one of the men dragging her onto the wasteland by the scarf and perhaps ended up killing her accidentally. This man then ran back to his friend, who was perhaps looking out, and told him he had killed her. An argument between the 2 then ensued. Then they fled into the darkness. Either way, the case frustratingly went cold with no further lines of inquiry to explore. Rumors persisted of US Air Force reluctance to fully cooperate with interviews, heightening local tensions. Women organized volunteer patrols for safety. The area later became known informally as Murder Mile due to a cluster of unsolved cases. Then on May 2nd, 1955, news broke of a potentially linked near-identical murder which police were investigating as potentially connected. At 8:30 p.m. on the 29th of April 1955, 47-year-old married woman Elizabeth Currell was out walking her dog Tina along Potter's Bar Golf Club in Middlesex when she was beaten over the head with a golf tee and then strangled. Her stockings had also been carefully rolled up and left beside her, as well as her shoes being neatly placed close by. The dog Tina returned home alone with the dog lead still attached, prompting her husband Alfred to call the police and go out searching. Her body would ultimately be found the following morning at 5 a.m. Police discovered bloody palm prints on the golf tee. Ultimately, police in this case would soon have their killer. After testing over 9,000 palm prints, one was found to match 17-year-old Michael Currell. He promptly confessed to the motiveless murder and was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. The following year, September 7th, police launched a murder investigation into the unsolved killing of 36-year-old Diana Suttey, who had been discovered by 3 boys in a bush off Green Lane in Leverstock Green, Hemel Hempstead. She had been strangled with her pink and white scarf and dumped out of a vehicle. One of the boys had even caught a glimpse of her killer and his vehicle as it fled. Her handbag and other accessories were also found close by. Eerily, Diana Suttey had lived just 4 miles away from Jean Townsend in Pinner Road, Harrow. However, this case too remains unsolved to this day, and it is not known what, if any, links police unearthed to connect the 2 cases. On the 5th of September 1957, news then broke of Scotland Yard having received new evidence into the unsolved murder of Ellen Carlin of Pimlico. Though that information was not divulged, it was stated that detectives had visited the US Army base multiple times with friends of Carlin in an attempt to ID the baby-faced American suspect. There is also brief mention again of ongoing probes with the Jean Townsend case, given some of the similarities. Ellen Carlin's case had surfaced in relation to a Scottish serial killer soon to be executed. Peter Manuel, The Scottish serial killer known as the Beast of Birkenshaw was convicted of 7 murders committed between 1956 and 1958 and hanged at Ballinilly Prison, Glasgow on 11th July 1958. While awaiting execution, he allegedly confessed to several additional unsolved killings, including the 1954 murder of Ellen Red Helen Carlin. Some investigating officers had believed he was responsible for more murders than those for which he had been convicted. However, his confession in Carlin's murder was never formally accepted by the Metropolitan Police, who did not close the case, with the confession still being described as alleged in official documents. Manuel was born in New York, but raised in Scotland, and had been in the London area around the time of Carlin's death, though his confirmed killing spree occurred later. Frustratingly, that is where this lead ends. Jean Townsend's case would ultimately cease any activity and go cold. No new leads would emerge for decades. In October 1982, Scotland Yard received a call from an anonymous informant who spoke to them in great detail about Jean Townsend's case. Though Scotland Yard would not divulge what this information was, they did confirm that the information given by this informant was corroborated by multiple people that were living locally in the area at the time. This phone call initially prompted detectives to reopen and reevaluate the case, but it was short-lived. Despite this new information, the case of Jean Townsend remained unsolved. In the early 90s, it was claimed by a daughter of one of the initial investigators that police had a very good suspect in the case, but due to the lack of evidence, they were never able to charge him. No physical evidence, such as DNA or fingerprints, has ever led to a breakthrough. The murder file remains sealed until 2031. In 2019, the case of Jean Townsend would come to life again with the publishing of Dead Fashion Girl, a situationist detective story by Fred Vennall. Vennall identifies Brinsley McDowell, a previously unknown local petty criminal and black marketeer active in the South Ruislip area, as a strong potential perpetrator. McDowell allegedly had connections that could link him to the crime scene or circumstances of the murder, but he reportedly had died in police custody. This suspect emerges from the author's archival work, interviews, and cross-referencing of local underworld black market networks rather than high-profile or foreign leads. Vennall frames the killing as a random, opportunistic, sordid act fitting McDowell's profile. Vennall then points to another suspect, Count Francesco Carlo Dallatri. Dallatri was an Anglo-Italian nobleman of mixed English-Italian parentage living in the London area in 1954. Rumours, which had originated partly from a BBC Radio 4 Home Truths interview with his former landlady, claimed he habitually rode the London Underground late at night, staring at passengers, drawing police attention more than once. He abruptly fled to Italy shortly after the murder and never returned, dying there in 1987. A US Air Force issue greatcoat with a missing button was allegedly found in his locked wardrobe, potentially aligning with another victim of an attempted strangling close by, that of Doris Mary Vennall, who was attacked just 2 weeks after Jean was murdered and just 2 miles away, though she is said to have ripped off 4 buttons of this man's jacket and not 1. But the Information Tribunal, which is tasked with assessing freedom of information requests, reviewed this theory in closed session and dismissed it as highly speculative, with no substantive evidence linking him to the case. And as of the airing of this documentary, the case officially remains unsolved. Jean Mary Townsend was just 21, a bright, elegant young woman with talent, charm, and a promising future in the world of London fashion and theatre. Taken far too soon on a quiet suburban walk home, she left behind parents who would never be the same and a mystery that still haunts South Ruislip to this day. Though her killer has never been brought to justice, Jean deserved to be remembered not as a victim, but as the vibrant fashion girl who lit up West End fitting rooms and Soho nights with her grace and quiet warmth. Her story remains a haunting reminder of innocence lost in the shadows of 1954, and a case that refuses to be forgotten. Thank you for watching and listening to Jean's story. Please feel free to add your own thoughts, theories, and comments down below, and we'll see you next time.